Welcome, everyone. We're going to let people get into the room, get situated, and we'll start in a few minutes. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. Hello, hello, everyone. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Hello, I am Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert and our invaluable part-timer Beth Golay, we run Exile and Bookville here in the Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago. Welcome back to our bi-monthly reading series, Caoilinn in Conversation, featuring authors that call the UK and Ireland home, curated by the super talented Caoilinn Hughes, author of The Wild Laughter. Caoilinn will be in conversation with the inimitable Roddy Doyle about his new short story collection, Life Without Children, which I haven't at the front counter has gotten a lot of stares and a lot of if onlys, which is a great title to the book. Before we get started, I want to encourage everyone here to keep your cameras on, but please mute yourselves during the event. Links to purchase books by both of our authors here today will be dropped into the chat during the discussion. Should you have any questions, please type them into the chat and Caoilinn will be happy to ask them of Roddy. There's lots to discuss today, so let's get started. Please welcome Roddy Doyle and Caoilinn Hughes. Have a great show, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Javier. Thanks, Beth, in the background, and Kristen, who I'm sure is there somewhere as well. And thanks to Exile and Bookville for hosting this this bi-monthly series. This is the first one for 2022. I'm still in denial that it's 2022, but it is. And no harm that the first guest is someone who doesn't need any introduction, I'm sure. But I'm tasked with the short intro, so I'll keep it brief. And I noticed that your publisher's bio includes your year of birth, which seems cruel. I don't have a Wikipedia has my own age wrong, and I feel like writing in. but anyway, Roddy Doyle is the author of 11 acclaimed novels. The Commitments, The Van, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize. He later won the Booker Prize with Paddy, Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, which is one of the most fabulous book titles of all time. The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, A Star Called Henry, which I believe is Roddy's dad's favorite of his books. Smile and Love, which came out during COVID, his most recent novel. He has several collections of stories, and he's written also for children and young adults, including the Rover novels. And he lives in Dublin, and it's Dublin that we're conversing with this evening. Roddy, as a point of introduction or a point of entry into our chat, I understand you play the trumpet. How did that go in lockdown?
Well, it's in the past tense. I did play the trumpet for a while. I can't remember how long ago I decided I want to play the trumpet. I've listened to music, love music. My books are full of music, but I never played an instrument. And I think I was heading towards the Irish Film Institute, the IFI in Dublin City Centre, chatting to my wife as we were going. I can't remember the movie, but there's an instrument shop right beside it, kind of hidden away. And she said, well, why don't you see about buying one now? So I went in and bought one. No idea how to play it, but I got lessons for a long, long time. It was slowly getting better. But my father fell ill around in 2013. And he was 90, so he'd had a great life, great long, and in his retirement years were brilliant. But after he died, I went to play the trumpet, and I couldn't get any noise out of it at all. I found that really distressing. I think it was just the grief manifesting itself physically, And I left it alone, and then I left it alone, and I left it alone, and I went back to it, and it was still too close or something. I didn't feel disloyal to my father by picking it up, because he would have, he'd have called me in Egypt, told me just, play the bloody thing. He played the banjo, much to our embarrassment when we were kids. But I never quite got back to it. It's over there in my office, right over there. But now that you mention it, I should really cop on and get back to it. So the short answer to your question is not at all.
So it didn't crop up. I was wondering
No.
whether it would crop up in one of the story collection.
No, I was listening to other people playing the trumpet, but not me.
Were you? Yeah, was it excruciating? We had a teenager learning the violin next door.
No, largely Miles Davis. So
okay.
Nothing that he ever played could be considered excruciating.
And in terms of this collection of stories, Life Without Children, I think probably because some of the audience will be in the US, and they may have heard some of the stories in the New Yorker or read them in the New Yorker, and but the whole collection is kind of linked through the theme that has arisen kind of naturally in this epoch of the pandemic, maybe moving into its endemic stage now. And so I wonder when you knew that you had a collection, or that you were working on a book, because as far as I understand, you had a novel that you were working on, which you abandoned.
I abandoned it for the first time. I think sometimes hard to recall, but because I've been writing novels for more than 30 years, so, but I hadn't gone too far into this one. I really didn't know what I was doing. I had a character. I thought there was a novel in him. It was a man. And I was kind of giving him flesh, so to speak. But about a week actually into the lockdown, the first lockdown in March 2020, I took it out and, decided to continue where I'd left off. And I read a bit of what I'd done already, and it just made no sense anymore. It was set in what we used to quite smugly call the present day, but that place didn't exist anymore, and I really didn't want to bring him into the lockdown. And, nobody really knew when it was going to end. We're talking about months, not years. There were a lot of experts on the radio saying contradictory things, but I just couldn't get into it anymore. And I'd been in Newcastle upon Tyne in England when Ireland went into lockdown, and England didn't go into lockdown. And for the first time, I felt really far away from home when I was in England. I've never felt that way before. First I was to England, and I still do, but I just felt so far from home and out of step. And I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as I possibly could. So I thought I could use that sense of disconnect to write a story. And as I was writing that story, I began to think of a woman using the lockdown as an opportunity to escape, to get away. And I thought, there's another story. So at that point, I thought, well, maybe I'll just keep writing short stories.
Yeah, because they're all really character-driven stories,
Yeah.
but the characters are quite subtly differentiated. They are dramatically different people if you kind of think about them in the long, with a long lens. But in the voice of the stories, you're not really pushing a very strong differentiation. They all kind of belong to a certain way of being in the world, or they're having a certain, similar.
Most of them are a certain age, shall we say, not too far from my own.
Yeah.
Just whether that's the limits of my imagination, or, I think sometimes experience ends up being useful from the writer's point of view. But I find and have found that getting older is the most interesting thing, really. How it changes the angle at which we look at things. The emotions are different. The phases of life are different. A lot of the men and the women in the stories, they're past children, so to speak, hence the title. And they're they don't even miss their children in a way anymore. It's more like they're wondering, what was that all about? You know, the last 30 years. And it's almost as if there wasn't a pandemic, they'd be invited to go back to their youth somehow, some decrepit version of youth, you know. And even there's a couple in one of the stories who almost fall in love. Oh, they do fall in love really in their early 60s. And he, who's been living with this woman for probably 30, 35 years, realizes for the first time that she actually likes a lot of the music that he likes. Like a lot of men, he hoards his music. He's very proprietorial. I'd imagine he scours Spotify looking for music that only 3 people have heard, you know, and he can claim it as his own. And then she comes into the kitchen and kind of he's stunned by her knowledge, you know. He's quite patronizing and she lets him know that, but they fall in love again. So it's people who are past a certain phase of their lives. Again, there's a man who has no children, no family whatsoever. I didn't want them all to be the composite 60-something man, you know. So I'm glad you said there are little subtle differences between them.
Yeah, and I think one of the differences, they seem to see the pandemic differently. You know, as you mentioned there, that one woman sees it as an opportunity for disappearance. That's a very specific thing to see in it.
Yeah, well, it was, you know, I've often imagined, you know, I don't know if you've ever been to the New York, the East Side Tenement Museum. And one of the families that lived in the building, the man just walked out of the house and never came back. He kind of disappeared. He had to be declared dead some years later so she could inherit, the woman who he left with children could inherit money that was due to him, but he disappeared. And I was thinking along the lines that, you know, that's a really great story, the fact that he could disappear. I'm not, you know, I was up for her, so to speak. She made an extraordinary life for herself in many ways, given the circumstances. It's a wonderful story. But I read somewhere that other people used 9/11 as an opportunity to disappear. And given that we can't walk down the street without being observed and recorded, and that we can be convicted for murder on the basis of our phones, it struck me that, you know, it must be really, really hard to disappear. And then walking down my street outside here, it's generally at certain times of the day quite busy. It was empty. I was walking down the middle of the street in the knowledge that I wasn't going to be hit by a car. Didn't even have to listen out. And at the end of my road, there's a very busy, like a main road to and from the city centre. And I knew that I could just walk straight across without looking left or right for quite a considerable time in 2020. And it struck me that bizarrely, this was the time you could possibly have a stab at disappearing because the streets were empty. So she uses this opportunity to disappear because it intrigued me. I mean, how do you disappear? A man who my father grew up with disappeared. He forgot all about him. And then I was half watching a program on, this is about 30 years ago, on Irish TV, a program on Irish TV, when there was a phone call and it was my father's brother saying, "Are you watching the thing on RTE? Your man we used to play football with, he's, you know, he disappeared." And he reappeared after 30 years, rang a doorbell in Tala in South County Dublin. And his daughter, who he'd never really known, opened the door and there he was. But you can't do that anymore in a way. Not that I'd want to.
Well, I moved to New Zealand for 7 years, and I was hoping for, you know, a ta-da thing in the end. But actually, I did. I turned back for my dad's 70th from New Zealand, and I turned up in a cardboard box, and he opened the box with a kitchen knife. So I nearly, nearly overshot it.
That could have been. Oh Christ! You could have been the first item on the news.
It would have been a great story, though. I actually would. I think it would be a good way to go.
God, get killed by your dad with a bread knife.
Unintentionally.
You know, I can't. No, it's a good
no
story.
Comment.
No, it's not something I'd ever wish on either me or my daughter.
Do you, this is quite I mean, I don't want to use the word brave, but it's a risky thing to do, to write about the present moment when there's no perspective on it, when we haven't gained any wisdom about it.
I've never gained any wisdom about anything in my life. I'm not sitting back for wisdom. I've got older, but the notion that you're a bit wiser, it's just pure bullshit. It doesn't happen. So if I was sitting around waiting for wisdom or something that I could generally pronounce, I'd never get anything done. But I thought stories were the way to go because they capture moments as opposed to. So if I was making a film, the camera would be bang up against the face of the characters, and I wouldn't be letting it, pan to the left or to the right to see what the rest of the world was doing, really. And if they do see the world, it's through TV or the radio. Everything is statistics. Everything is, death rates, infection rates, things like that. So it's purely from their perspective, their kind of jarred perspective. So it just struck me as being a way for me to continue writing through 2020, really, because every other aspect of my professional life had gone, 3 plays that were supposed to be produced, 2 tours and a new production, gone. Everything was gone. So I was confident writing the short stories, not confident that they were any good, but confident that they were doable, and that I could get up. I'm not as obsessive about working 9 to 5 as I used to be, but when I say get up the stairs, my office is in the attic, and be happy enough to continue writing, feeling that I wasn't just filling hours of the day, that I was actually doing something that might get to an end,
Yeah. I mean, and so I suppose one of the benefits of it is that you don't have that, you're with a book like that, you're not being plagued by that question of worthiness. I don't know whether you ever are, but it's certainly something that I think early on in books is really difficult. I procrastinate for a long time before starting a book because I want it to kind of prove itself to me until the power dynamic totally flips and I feel responsible to it. But at least I mean I think that's very good that you have that, were able to find that space for yourself where you weren't
well, yeah, I don't tend to procrastinate. I'm always up to something, I can't remember a prolonged period over the last 30 odd years when I haven't been working, except holidays are kind of easy to switch off then, and at weekends and things like that. But you're right in one sense. I wasn't immersing myself in a big novel or anything like that, or trying to come across a world that was worth writing about. But in a way as well, finishing a short story and starting another one is not unlike finishing a novel and starting another one. You need a new plot. You need a whole gang of people. You need new names for characters. And that's a pain in the arse because I grew up in an era when there were 54 boys in my class in primary school, and if the teacher had said Paddy, 10 of them would have said what. I didn't grow up with a rich array of names. Most of the guys I hung around with, they shared about 10 names between the whole lot of them, and that I think was my editor and publisher, when he was going through the stories, wondered whether 2 of the stories were linked because the protagonists had the same name, but it was an accident.
Right.
I'd forgotten that I'd named another guy. I can't even remember. I think it was Mick. I used the name Mick for characters. I don't know how many men through my life called Mick that I've known,
Mm-hmm.
Just when I stray away from the more common, what would have been the more common male names for the average Irish boy, I don't feel as confident. So, so I had to come up with character names all the time, which, and I think there might be one story where I didn't give a couple of stories where I deliberately didn't give the characters names at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a relief.
Yeah, you could have tried first person. That would have been a way out.
Yeah, true enough. Yeah.
The book, apart from having this context of COVID, it's been described as a book about marriage. I think I've seen a few reviews that talked, and I suppose maybe because I'm not particularly interested in the institute of marriage, I was reading it more as about companionship and about company and its absence, what lurks in its absence.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's marriage per se, whether they're formally married or not. I think, I've come across people who, you tend to think are man and wife because they've reached a certain age, but actually they never did the deed, so to speak. They never, either went up to the church or into the registry office, So I don't think it's that. I think it's long-term relationships somehow. And how they're, how they change. I mean, not just with age, but with circumstances. Ireland is such a different place. I met my wife in the mid-80s, the mid-1980s, and now we're in, if I'm not mistaken, 2022. And the place we met was so different to the place we live in now. The whole idea that there would have been gay marriage was kind of laughable, or that abortion would be available as a right was just beyond science fictional, So we met in a different world, really, and then, so we're older, but we met in a different world. And then there's children who grow up into adults, and, so I was interested in, I often look at, a bit like Alan Bennett, his parents who used to sit and watch the world go by and make up the stories of people they didn't know and judge, make assumptions about them because of their facial expressions or something like that. And I suppose I do that, and as do all writers, without actually having to look at real people. But one of the ones I look at these days, I often wonder, I see a couple with a baby, and I wonder, are they the parents or the grandparents? And if they look relaxed, they're the grandparents. If they look frazzled and exhausted, they're the parents. But to my limited view, because I grew up at a time in the 60s and the 70s where houses were full of children, and people started having them very, very young, that it seems bizarre sometimes to see people that I would consider on the cusp of middle age with babies. Do you know what I mean? So these things shift and change as one gets older, and yet couples often stay with each other right through these phases. They're not the same people in a way. They're not the same people 30 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. It's entirely different. So it's they have the same names, and they're probably, introduced in the same order right through their lives, depending on the rhythm of the names. But in fact, they may as well be two entirely different beings. If they walk out of a room and 30 years later walk back into the room, you can say you know them, but actually they're just so different, and they get different together and sometimes not together. Yeah. So there's endless amounts of stories in it, So I was just intrigued by it, and particularly this notion. My mother died some 4 years ago, and in the last months of her life, she was 92. So again, it was no great tragedy, but she was very ill, really, for the last few months of her life. And myself and my siblings tried our best to look after her in her house, the house she walked into the first time with my father in 1951. They lived there all their married lives, and so in the last months, I'd often spend the whole day with my mother and then sleep in that house where I grew up as well. And her taste in television programs wasn't like mine. She watched a lot of what I thought was really bad detective stories, old-fashioned detective stories, on a channel, a British channel, old, 1980s.
Murder, She Wrote kind of stuff.
Stuff like that. Some of them not so bad, some of them awful, but the ads were all aimed at people of a certain age, and there's like grey-haired couples in linen walking along beaches. This is their grey years, or they're the last third. What's it called? There is a formal name, sort of marketing name for the last third of your life.
Oh God, I don't want to know it.
Well, how anybody could be smug enough to think that the last third of their life is actually the last third, and they're not going to be hit, hit by a heart
By a
attack.
truck on the spot, exactly.
But anyway, it's all this stuff is presented as opportunity. And I was looking at these ads, people in Greek islands, people in, smiling, all, sweaters draped over their shoulders, and I was thinking, and on cruises, and I was thinking, Jesus, I'd hate that. Absolutely hate it. And yet it's presented, it's advertising, so they want to sell it to me. And I really don't want to buy it, far from. I'd like to put a match to it. I don't want anything to do with it. So it's interesting how these last, assuming my dad was 90, my mother was 92. So, if it's a mathematical equation, I'm going to live till I'm 91. I'm not banking on it. I'm not even hoping for it. But what do I do with the rest of my life? And this is what I was thinking with a lot of these characters. What do you do? And
well, they seem to all crave company. I mean, that is something that they lose out in COVID.
Yeah, they do. And they there's one character, Mick, in a story, The Charger, in COVID, ironically, because he is in the house with his wife and his children, his daughters, who he adores, have come back into the house for the duration of the first, until they get bored and they start drifting, mysteriously disappearing and coming back, which amuses him as much as anything else. It doesn't worry him. But he discovers really how utterly dependent he is on his wife. And he's ashamed of it to a degree because he doesn't understand things that she understands. But she's his one, if you like, his one vital friend, and this is what he realizes. He hasn't had to realize it, in a way. They seem to be a perfectly compatible couple. She loves him for his failings as much as anything else, and he makes the most of his failings, and he's a very funny man. And his children, his daughters, I think, see him for what he is, a decent, reliable, stable man. But he's shattered because he's terrified that his wife is going to fall ill, and that she's already ill. And then there's another couple who really discover themselves, each other, as if they'd never known each other. And I think the starkest story is one called The Mask, where there's a man who's never had any sort of a family structure, and the only structure to his life has been taken away. The whole scaffolding of his life, going to work, working, coming home, the things that give him dignity, the things that allow him not to think too much about the way his life has gone, that allow him to keep going, they're gone. And there's no, what would you say? There's no sourdough moments in this man's life, He's not going to be experimenting with spices in the kitchen. He's utterly alone and trying to walk his anger away, trying and understand it, but he hates what he sees. He hates everything that he encounters, really. He feels threatened by it. Buskers, young women singing. He just detests it all because none of it is his, I think, in a way, and he doesn't understand it. And he's totally and utterly alone. And that was a hard one in a way. The plot, not so much, but getting into his state of mind. In some ways, the rhythm of it was easy because, a lot of us were doing a lot of walking. We were allowed to walk 2 kilometers. And I could see some people walking those 2 kilometers about 10 times a day. There's a guy up the street from me here, and I thought he must have lost about 4 stone in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown. And he must have been getting a lot of deliveries. He was he went from jeans and a sweater to all sorts of gear. He and he'd head off as if he was going to take the run at Kilimanjaro, whereas he was only going 2 kilometers to the local supermarket and back, but he was out all the time. And I got to say, I was wondering what's going on there. It's not just exercise. So that's, I don't know, the restlessness, the anxiety, all these things. And, so I think it invited, like Alan Bennett's parents, it invited stories, really, making up stories.
Yeah. one of the other things that comes up in the book that I'm very interested in, so maybe I was seeing it everywhere, is regret. And I find that it's almost I'm interested in it conversationally, but it's almost a taboo topic. Especially, I found, especially in the US, if I'm ever talking to my American friends, there's almost a self-help automation that kicks in. What's done is done. It's unhealthy to look back over these things outside of the context of therapy. I'm kind of interested in that, because it creates maybe a kind of a very large blind spot, and you see your stories, this collection, this book seems to be interested in people who are looking in that blind spot all the time, thinking what could have been there, how could I have done things differently? Were you conscious of that? Are you interested in that?
I am, yeah, inevitably. I think, again, it's the angle I'm coming from, having lived, I'm into my 7th decade, and I have a very good memory. I think there was a thing I recently saw on the TV, the man who wrote My Way, Paul Anka. There was footage of him singing the song. It must have been very soon after he wrote it. I think
You
it may
Are
have
So
been
Beautiful, is it?
No, My Way,
Oh, right.
regrets
Sorry,
I have a
the
few.
Sinatra song. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, Sinatra made it his own, but Paul
Right.
Anka wrote it. So there's Paul Anka dressed in black and a dicky bow or a bow tie, singing, regrets I have a few, but, lots of regrets I have a few, but then again, too few to mention. But he looked about 20. It was absurd, He looked, put a little crest on him and he would have been making his Holy Communion, He looked just out of childhood, and he's singing about regret. And of course, you could do something and regret it. But yeah, I think it's inevitable that we regret things. And to a degree, it's superfluous. What's the point? But on the other hand, it's inevitable. You just look back and you think, oh, it's that sometimes it's quite facile. It's the conversation you didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
What you would say if you had a second chance, what you would do if you had a second chance, the mistake you wouldn't make if you could do it again, the mistake you would repeat if you could do it again. So, yeah, regret, I think, is a vital. Trying to avoid regret, I think, would probably lead to some sort of mental chaos, probably a deeper sense of regret. So I think, I've no problem. Obviously in my personal life, I'm not going to go into my the public domain and list off my regrets, but there, there are more than a few. Mind you, I've been around a lot longer than Paul Anka was when he wrote that song. I understood then. I mean, I'd sing along if it was, if I was at a party and somebody was singing it, I'd happily sing along. But I've always had my doubts about that song,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there is a difference between the type of stereotypical middle-aged man regret, where you're thinking, what if, outside of the solidity of the traditional family model. But that's not what this book is about at all. It's not type of
no, I'll tell you, it's not about sometimes I was a high school teacher for 14 years. I stopped in 1993, so quite a long time ago, nearly 30 years. And I worried that over the years, my memories became fonder because I was getting older and it was becoming more distant. And of course, I could, brush off the tricky bits and just think about the good stuff. And everything was rosy. And I wouldn't bother asking myself, well, it was so great. Why did you stop? So eventually I began to, I'm not talking about regret here per se, but I'm talking about more the validity of memory and the things that we touch and the things that we forget about. Out of the blue, only a few weeks ago, I got an email from an old student of mine. And I'd often wondered about how she was. For various reasons, I'd wondered about how she was on and off for years. And I was in the kitchen, it was at the weekend, got this email, this absolutely lovely email from this woman who's now in her late 40s. And it was the most brilliant thing because it actually confirmed to a degree the honesty of my memory. And I had gone through, I wouldn't say decades, but I'd gone through moments in those decades worried that what I tried to do as a way to help her had been totally inadequate. You know, that I'd done what casually is often called my best, but actually my best was not enough. But the email seemed to confirm that, certainly from her point of view, it had been very welcome. And that was a brilliant thing to get. What you do with it creatively, I haven't a clue. I have no idea, because it veers on the, you know, from a human level, it's utterly honest. If you tried to capture it on paper, it could possibly become sentimental. And it's funny that way. We don't like happy stories, really.
Well, I mean, on that note, there are several of the stories in this book, and particularly Five Lampposts, the last story. A story in which the dad is a father's trying to find his son who left 4 years ago on the emptied streets, and thinking that he might be able to find him in this context, and has nothing but positive encounters with the strangers that he interacts with. It reminded me, there are moments in the book that reminded me of that kind of unapologetic romanticism that I really like in Kevin Barry's work, because I do think it's a little bit it's up against a moment where literalness is and earnestness are kind of approved of forms more so than, say, anything that veers on the romantic. I'm wondering, especially, you know, I can be a very kind of Scroogey person, but it brought to mind, even in my own, you know, cold cockle heart, Don Patterson has a poem. And I don't think I can recite the whole poem to you, but I'll read the part that it brought to mind, and the book as a whole, and see, I don't know whether or not you've ever heard this bit. The poem is called Waking with Russell, and it's about his son who was smiling for 4 days, and it's about this smile. And halfway through the poem, he says, "Dear son, I was mezzo del cammin, and the true path was as lost to me as ever. When you cut in front it and lit it as you ran. See how the true gift never leaves the giver. Returned and redelivered, it rolled on until the smile poured through us like a river. How fine, I thought, this waking amongst men. I kissed your mouth and pledged myself forever." Which is, you know, a love poem kind of this massive kind of, you know, enormous scale for, you know, a baby that can't kind of reciprocate vocally. But that, anyway, that came to mind. I don't know if you know his poetry at all, or whether you read poetry.
I don't, but I will. That was lovely.
Yeah, that's from a book called Rain.
Right, I'll get it.
Yeah.
But the Five Lamps, I deliberately wanted to have some sort of a, I don't know, fairy tale quality to it, really. And it was the last story I wrote. And even though it's set at the beginning of the first lockdown, and I started it almost literally a year after the start of the lockdown. So it was a year of living with the pandemic. It was extremely difficult to get back to that point, even though it was only a year. Ordinarily in my life, what was life like a year ago? Much the same as it is now, you know? Yeah. But this time, I don't think we can do that anymore, or certainly for temporarily, we can't do that anymore. So it was really hard to get back to the state of mind that this man would be in a year before. And I suppose what's reflected in it, in the story, is the fact that Ireland, actually, the Republic of Ireland, certainly my patch of the world, was quite a gentle place during the pandemic. We're supposed we have a reputation for being wild and unpredictable, but the level of compliance when it came to the vaccine uptake was huge. Yeah. And, you know, the same with mask wearing, the same with social distancing.
And care for huge. And care for the elderly as well. Yeah.
And because we're a very small country, you know, with a very small population, you couldn't help but fall across these stories, you know, about people looking after other people and little acts of kindness, you know. And I didn't know this when I was starting the story, but this man, a bit like the character in the Masks, or in Masks, that other story, he's put on a set of blinkers, and he, you know, not just for the throughout his life really, and he hasn't looked to the left or the right, and he hasn't been open to change or open to the unpredictable or open to generosity. And as he looks for his son, and he takes the same route, a somewhat linear route from down the end of my road here, actually, to the city centre and then along the river. I think there's about 2 corners he has to change for the entire journey, which would take him about 2 hours walking. He encounters people who are nothing but nice to him, and quite unpredictably so. A woman outside a methadone clinic who you'd expect, you know, as she comes running towards him, you'd expect her to, you know, want something.
Yeah.
You know, instead she's giving him something, you know. And he encounters these different people, and they all kind of encourage him. And I suppose the last is the little girl at the end of the story, and she says something that I don't think an adult would get away with, you know. And I like her as a character. She's only there for probably a page, but I think she picked up her language from her grandmother, this kind of inner city, old-fashioned Dublin woman. And this little kid speaks like an inner city, old-fashioned Dublin woman in many, many ways, and says something to him that, as I said, possibly one of his peers could never get away with, you know. So that, I really liked writing that story, and it got longer and longer. I had to trim it back because I was tempted to keep going. I didn't want it to end, you know. And I call it the 5 lamps because, one, it's very close to me. I either walk by it or go by it in the bus or drive by it, sometimes twice a day. And also he walks past it on his route. And then it struck me how many people, and I decided, 5, you know, seemed to be a good number.
Yeah, I get there's fairy tale-ish reasons I can imagine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But there, you know, I suppose that there are moments then where you do get a little bit of a more cynical voice, I suppose, to counteract that. There's a part in the funeral where the lines really jumped out in the book. So the Irish know what to say. They know how to sing. They know how to get drunk. They know how to stay polite for the day. If there's genius, if there's a national flair, it's in the ability to get rat-arsed and remain civil and cute, to let go and hold back, to wait. And that sounds almost like, you know, a different kind of perspective on the kindness, you know.
Oh yeah, I'm not a total sap. Yeah, different type of story, different kind of, you know. I could only imagine. I suppose because a lot of the people who I'd have grown up with, my parents, their brothers and sisters, a lot of them, you know, most of them are dead, you know, and were dead before the pandemic. So I'm lucky insofar as I didn't have to deal with firsthand grief. But of course, again, it being a small country, we do funerals well. I mean, the vast majority of people I know would much prefer a good funeral to a wedding any day of the week. It's fundamentally a better experience in many ways, leaving aside the fact that you're burying a loved one. But it just seems to be emotionally bang on in a way that weddings often aren't. I suppose you're just looking at a wedding and you're wondering how long they last. What a waste of money, really. You don't kind of say that about a funeral. But all these stories that where you are limited to the amount of people you could bring to a funeral, and that immediately becomes political, doesn't it? You know, it's a limited thing. It's a limited amount of people can go, and the fact then that, you know, the harrowing fact that you couldn't actually be present at the death of a loved one, that only one person could go into ICU to represent the whole, you know, and who's that person going to be? And of course, you know, I could imagine a group of siblings amongst themselves saying, "Oh, you go, Mary," or "You go, John," and they go in and they're resented for the rest of their lives, even though they were chosen to go. But they're also, if you like, you know, they're going to be the scapegoat somehow as well. It's inevitable. So it's like the conditions, the pandemic was inflicting this cruelty. And what I was trying to do with that story was to kind of get under that politics, the politics of a family, particularly given that the mother has planted little bombs to make sure that the family, you know, will probably fall apart after she dies. You know, she's not consciously aware of it, one would hope, but she's designed her will to make sure that the inevitable happens. And what I really liked about writing that story is that the guy in the story is drunk. And it was very hard to get from beginning to, I was stone cold sober for the entire time that I wrote the story. Actually didn't drink at all during the lockdowns, but it was great fun imagining the drunken logic of a man in the kitchen who's woken up thinking I'm sober. I was drunk yesterday, but I'm fine now. But he's only been asleep or, you know, comatose for a couple of hours, and he's still off in his head, you know. And that was writing that was hugely enjoyable. But despite the fact that it's deeply sad, it was hugely enjoyable.
Yeah. No, you can tell it's there's an energy to the prose. Yeah, that kind of.
I hope so.
Yeah, like a very kind of theatrical take on the society being represented in that story. I'll ask you another question, and then I'll see if there's any audience questions. So if you want to ask something, now's the time to type it into the chat. I'm torn now what to ask you because I have a rake of questions still, but I suppose work is something that I feel I should bring up because it is it is explored in the book. It's a consequence of what the pandemic kind of made people aware of, the whether or not their work was vital, whether or not they were what was it, vital workers, was that the phrase used, and there was a difference then, you know, in the precariat jobs. I think in my generation, you know, the precariat jobs are almost the ones that are explored more in books than working class jobs. Whereas in this book, I think it's more a representation, less about precarity and more about the meaning of work in a working class job, and what happens when that job is no longer there. What people, you know, are you aware of that, or is that just something that you're naturally kind of writing about, these types of characters? I know that you've had all sorts of jobs yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've had two basic ones. I've done a lot of work, but the two jobs that would probably, you know, define me are teaching and writing. You know, I've done other work which was useful, factory work, bar work, street cleaner for a while, which, you know, the kind of creative muscle memory that 6 or 7 months gave me is phenomenal. It's never been far away, you know. So I think, and factory work was really, really useful. The rhythm of it, the noise of it, the companionship, the absurdity of it. A lot of it was just, you know, it's adjectives, you know. And I think my father, for example, you know, he left school at 15 because an apprenticeship came up, and he didn't want to leave school, but he didn't have the choice. This was an opportunity. So he served his time for 7 years and became a printer, a compositor. And that's how he was defined, you know. And I think it's the same with a lot of these men, including men of my own generation. I think women roll better with it, I think, but men have this adjective, this job description kind of inflicted on them. And I've known it's a worrying trend that it is there, that a lot of men who retire in that they just stop doing what they've been doing since, some of them 16, 18, 21. They don't live long. You know, they can't cope. There's nothing. Once work stops, life stops, really. They're living with a stranger in the house. You know, they don't have companionship, they don't have interests, they don't. And I'm not talking about men in general. I'm talking about men I have observed, men I have, you know, been told about. And potentially all the men in the stories could be that man. You know, on a comic level, when I stopped being a teacher and became a writer, I couldn't actually see writing as a job. I did, until so far as I spent 8 hours a day doing it. And I always described it as labor, but I couldn't actually justify it to myself for a long, long time. And right about 2 years after I gave up teaching, somebody said, "What do you do for a living?" It was a question people used to ask. "What do you do for a living?" And I said, I used to be a teacher. I couldn't say I'm a writer.
Yeah.
I'd have been happier saying I'm a bus driver, you know.
Yeah.
And then it's a bit like the children grow up and there's no longer children there. And this definition, you're always I'll always be a father, but not in the way that I was for 3 decades or longer. It's a different experience altogether. And it's the same for a lot of men, I think. And I'm saying men a lot, but most of the stories are about men, that once work stops or once it's edging closer to, stopping, it's a vital part of the scaffolding that's coming away, and I don't think it's thought about too carefully.
Mm.
So there's that notion of work, so much easier. Most men who got a job stayed with that job, that skill, that craft all their working lives. Things are seem much more flexible now.
Mm.
So that I wouldn't feel at all confident if I was building a story around a 30-year-old man or a 30-year-old woman. I wouldn't feel at all confident at this point in my life that I could capture it, really, because I find
it is very different. There is a generational difference with work. And I mean, I'm always recommending David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, because for me, I'm 36, and I feel that it really represents what's happened to work. I think for millennials, what's happened to work and how quality of life is being masked by the precarious jobs that, for example, if those ones disappeared during COVID, it wasn't that people didn't have anything to do. It's that they realized that work had been taking up every minute of their lives because they were constantly trying to piecemeal things together, because they didn't have any of the surety of ongoingness that then they realized there were major problems. But I found that interesting, the way that it was dealing with the work. I mean, you brought up yourself being a writer and the difficulty of acknowledging it as work. There's also an interesting problem in writing about retirement and writing about the existential angst of your work disappearing, when you and I, Roddy, I don't think we're ever going to retire. I mean, we don't retire. I've never known a writer to retire.
No.
Our publishers might retire us. But
that's a different tragedy. No, I mean, retirement doesn't have meaning for me. I mean, if I'd stayed as a teacher, I probably could have retired by now if I'd wished, but I don't. It's not really the notion of me deciding to stop thinking like a writer, to stop coming up with stories, to stop feeling that I want to write a story, or it's just unimaginable. It's not something I'd crave or want. I am more flexible with my time. I'm beginning to, finally realize that I can get an awful lot done in an hour or 2 hours, that I don't have to spend all day coming up with the 1,000 words that I'd like to write a day, that actually I've always been very self-disciplined and I can do an awful lot and not necessarily work the same way that I used to work. But that's not retirement. That's just apportioning your time differently, Yeah. So no, the notion of retirement, it's the energy, really. It's the energy. If the energy is there, I'm still a writer. It's a creative energy, but it's almost physical as well. If it's there, I write. I'm writing a book at the moment with the Olympic boxer Kelly Harrington. She won a gold medal. And again, being a small country, gold medal, it's a huge deal. And it's Kelly's words. She's 32, so she's literally half my age. It's all Kelly's words. I kind of deliberately haven't even looked at any of her boxing fights, because I want her to describe them for me. And it's such a joy assembling her words. Like it is, contractually, she's the author and I'm the writer. But to be given her words, normally I make them up, but I have her words and I'm trying to assemble the story, and it's great. It's very collaborative, but there's nothing in me saying, this isn't great, this isn't good, this isn't something I should do or should have done. It's an adventure, trying to put a story together by a woman half my age, a boxer. She's much loved in this country. because she hits other women, you know,
And takes hits,
which,
that's a bigger thing.
yeah, she tries to be, as she says, she tries to hit them more often than they hit her. And she, in her descriptions of the fights and the science of it, really, the tactics, the skills, it's absolutely brilliant. So it's like, this time last year, I had no idea this was going to happen. Actually, this time 6 months ago, I had no idea this was going to happen.
Yeah, I love that as a counterpart to the Roy Keane, is that his name? The football.
Oh yeah, another great experience, brilliant
Yeah.
experience. But if I had shut myself down to the notion that I would do something like this, you know, there's a regret.
Yeah.
Except I wouldn't be aware of it, you know. But I know it's a fresh experience. If I shut myself down to that kind of thing,
yeah, it would be.
No, it's not a loss to anybody except perhaps myself and Kelly at the moment. But a huge, I don't know, a huge opportunity, a huge, you know, brilliant experience, time consuming, but really, really brilliant. And it just strikes me that if I decided, no, I won't do anything like that ever again, I'm really shutting several doors there that I don't really need to shut.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Roddy, I'm going to sneak in a question from the audience here. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's a male name. Jordis Halvorsen. And they've said, I loved hearing you talk about how we're given different people than we were decades ago, how we're different people than we were decades ago, and how couples become that together. To what extent does that apply to your writing, your earlier works to now?
Oh, yeah. Oh, to a big extent. For job reasons, I reread my first novel, The Commitments, a few years ago. And it felt very familiar. You know, should be, I wrote it. So it felt very familiar, and it's very short, so there wasn't much memory involved. The language struck me as being, the bulk of it as being kind of timeless. I could well imagine the characters speaking much the same way today. The rhythm might be slightly different. There might be more likes in the average sentence, but they're there, you know, in 1986 when I wrote the book, they're there. Ireland was a different place though. It's extraordinary. A lot of the casual sexism embarrassed me, not because it's politically incorrect, but because it struck me as being dated. You'd nearly want, I don't know, footnotes sometimes when you come across the language that was used. But it's of its time, and it was, you know, it's honest of its time. But I can't imagine being able to write something like that anymore. And I wouldn't have any interest in writing anything like that anymore. The same with some of the other books. Some of them, yeah, no bother. It's not a lack of energy, it's a lack of perspective, I think, you know. One of my children lives in a house with other men his own age. You know, could I write a story set in that house? No. I used to be that age. I used to live in houses with other men and women that age, but I don't want to write about somebody in 1980 something or other living in a house with other men and women up there, you know, in their late 20s, early 30s. I just don't want to do that. So I think my writing has changed. Again, it's with age. Like the first 3 novels were linear because I didn't know what else to do. Then I became a bit more adventurous because I was tired of writing linear stories and thought, well, I'll have a stab at telling stories differently. But I think I probably had to write the first 3 in that straight line structure before I could start thinking about writing a story in a different shape and experimenting a bit. Then I wrote another book that was set, you know, 100 years ago. And for that, I had to be more, I don't know, wordy, a W-R-D-Y, because I had to describe a place really that doesn't exist anymore.
Trying to think of what else wordy could be, except
worthy.
Oh.
But as a Dublin person, the word worthy is too much work. It's always not wordy.
I'm from Galway, we're worse.
Wordy. So yeah, so I think, yeah, the writing has changed with age, partly because of the subject matter, but partly because it's built on experience, really. And it's built on the fear of repetition. That's, I suppose, is one of the big anxiety I have, a little bit like, you know, writing 2 short stories with the same male character name. I've often now in recent years realized early on into something, I've done this before, you know, not literally word for word, but I've looked at things from that angle before. I'm repeating myself. And I suppose it's inevitable because I've been doing it for a long time, but you know, it's an anxiety I have. So that shoves me towards writing something fresh.
Yeah. And yeah, you can discover that you start to have mega themes, which is the terrifying thing. They're very much involuntary.
Always somebody else comes up with that observation, never me. And I don't tend to pay too much attention.
No,
You
I
know.
have it if a book is failing and I'm early, you know, I'm saying 30,000 words into a book, and I'll be walking with my partner and I'll be describing the thing, trying to see, is it ever going to make any sense? Does it make any sense so far? What's there? And I'll be saying it out loud because I write without a plan. I think like yourself, into the dark.
Yeah, I don't have a plan.
But I keep describing what's already there because it seems so it can sometimes seem so random. I'm just interested in these characters and I'm following them, and I don't know if I want to follow them for 3 years and have them lead me off a cliff, you know. I'm angry at them and everything, and then I start to say what's happening in the thing. And I've remembered actually one time during lockdown stopping on the middle of the road in Connemara. There was nobody around anywhere, and within our 5 kilometers there was nobody, and just going, oh my god. And I named my mega theme to the universe. If by naming it I could somehow like absolve myself of it, but it's horrendous.
I'm just feeling sorry for your partner, what he has to endure.
Oh, stop.
It must be terrible living with a writer.
Oh, I would never do it. I don't know. I don't understand the couple writers.
No. No.
I think we probably need to bring Javier back in and to do some housekeeping. But there's a couple of nice comments from people who just had to leave.
That was fantastic. Just as I envisioned it in all of my nightmare dreams leading up to this. I was very nervous about this, but Roddy, you were fantastic. Caoilinn, as always.
So's your woman.
Everyone is. This is just a great conversation. And Caoilinn, as always, you nail it every single time. We're so glad to have you curate this reading series for us.
It was a huge pleasure, Caoilinn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roddy.
Yeah,
and you must. If you're in Chicago, you must go into Exile in Bookville. It's a very cool
yeah,
yes,
definitely.
And hopefully one of these days, either or both of you will grace our bookstore. It'd be great to see you guys here.
It's a nice
Thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we thank you. We'll see you in a couple of months, or maybe next month, who knows? But thanks for tuning in, and goodbye to everyone, and have a great day.
Bye. Thanks so much.
See you.
Bye, Caoilinn. Thanks, Roddy.